Please be seated. Proceedings are resumed. I'll invite the Honorable 5th elected member from the District of Georgetown to continue his debate with an hour and 15 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. When I left off, I was talking about the need for mandatory codes of conduct in the professions. And I spoke about examples of people coming here who had serious allegations and sometimes convictions in other areas. Thanks, Madam Speaker. In other jurisdictions, and yet got second chances in the Cayman Islands because either appropriate checks and balances were not there to stop them at the gate, or it was missed before they came in. Madam Speaker, there are a number of things that you would expect in a first world country in terms of regulating professions. Disciplinary actions for negligence, failure to correct shoddy work, failure to make provisions for complying with all applicable laws, rules, regulations, bylaws, standards, and codes. Madam Speaker, I had representations of people signing off on work that is done halfway around the world. In situations like that, if nobody is checking, it's easy to kill a profession in the islands, and those few at the top that would outsource everything are basically closing doors for young Caymanian professionals. Madam Speaker, as part and parcel of government facilitating the registration or regulation of professional bodies, it's incumbent on government to ensure that there are high standards. However, it satisfies itself that those standards are being achieved, monitored, and where there are penalties, if appropriate, I leave that up to the government. But there needs to be avenues where the public can make complaints and have a reasonable expectation of the process by which that profession will go through to make inquiries, and also what the likely outcome of that type of allegation, if founded, will be. And the powers of such a body would include dismissal of the complaints and some other order of a disciplinary nature, removal from registers, suspension, payment of penalties, payment of costs, that sort of thing, Madam Speaker. And then you have to put in the proper appeals if you have those avenues. And those appeals would normally go to the Grand Court. Madam Speaker, like any good governance process, you would also want periodic reviews of those in charge. You can't have entities governing themselves without any checks and balances. Not if you don't want a black eye at some point in time down the road. It's incumbent on Cabinet to be the body that would review these types of activities, including receiving annual reports from professions. Madam Speaker, we can't just call ourselves first world. That's my point. We have to actually show that we have all the proper procedures, not just the ones we pick and choose and tailor, but all of the components that would occur in those first world countries that we get labor from, including the UK, Canada, the US, and other places such as those. We can't leave a fox in control of the hen house. If not, you will have the law of unintended consequences bearing fruit. Madam Speaker, it's also about control of what goes on within your borders. It does not have to be draconian, it does not have to be a heavy hand, but somebody needs to be looking. The government is also there to set out parameters to oversee these professions and to ensure that changes in particulars are monitored in association with all the laws of the land, and that slipping through the cracks is not allowed. Madam Speaker, qualifications, grades, additional certifications, and tracking of every professional body and its members needs to take place. Because how else are we going to compare our homegrown professionals to international standards and to see where they match up in terms of people coming here with similar qualifications? Questions that encompass the functions of professional bodies in line with our laws need to be in place, including what the plans are for Caymanian training and advancement. Because how else are we going to gauge progress, Madam Speaker, if we don't have a baseline, if we don't have intentions, and we don't have actions? People need to be held to account. Firms need to be held to account, especially when they hold themselves out as professionals. How do you determine whether or not a professional is qualified, competent? How do you say when somebody who is a trainee has done all the things that allow them to be called a professional and gauge their progress? I dare say that when I was doing my research, the best example that I had of a well-oiled professional body is CEPA, that governs the accountants. Maybe it's because it's their nature to be precise that they treat it the way that they do, that when the chairman gets up and starts her speeches, as we're here to make dreams come true, it shows that they take it seriously. Madam Speaker, there are a number of functions that we need to see from our professional bodies and our professionals. And the continuing education component is one such function. Support for that continuing education through learning opportunities and tools for recording and planning are paramount to any professional body. Publishing of data is also another. Following a mandatory code of conduct to guide professional behavior is another example. Dealing with complaints against professionals and implementing disciplinary procedures, yet another. But also by enabling fairer access to the profession so that people from all backgrounds can become professionals. Especially, Madam Speaker, since I'm speaking with my MLA hat on, especially the young people of this island. Professional bodies in first world countries also provide career support and opportunities for students, graduates, and people already working. If these things are missing, Madam Speaker, from any of the professional bodies in the Cayman Islands, we're failing our people. Because what we're doing is allowing people to come here, tap into the good name of the Cayman Islands, milk it for all it's worth, and not pay anything back. And if we continue to do this, we continue to turn a blind eye, we should not be in this position, Madam Speaker, because we're failing our people. every person who wants to go to university and or have a professional career deserves to be treated in the same way as other persons with the same qualifications. Madam Speaker, if this is not happening in the Cayman Islands, we need to look into it. Admissions and recruitment processes should have no bias based on family background, social class, gender, ethnic origin. That is what fair process is about. Madam Speaker, we've left it to some of these bodies, and they've been found wanting. We can't continue to be so subjective that we turn away our people with the same or better qualifications. It just can't continue. If we are going to modernize our laws and our ways that we govern professional bodies, then take a page out of the professional bodies that we claim to come from. There are a number of initiatives and projects to ensure that even unconscious bias is removed from hiring, training, and promotion. If you sit here, and if I hear any politician say, oh, we don't have these problems in Cayman, I want a sip of what they're drinking. We need to show courage, we need to show initiative, and we need to show our people that we're working for them even when they can't work for themselves. They can't talk for themselves. That is what we were elected to do. And if we are afraid to do it, then we should go home, or the people that elected us should exercise their vote and get rid of us. Madam Speaker, government needs to lead the way because the professions in many instances have been found wanting. And we see what happens when we have professions and professional bodies that take their responsibilities seriously. We see the Caymanians moving to the very top of that profession and leaving a legacy for those coming behind them and ensuring the high standards, because there's a certain pride in being a professional, and especially if you're being engaged worldwide and know that you can rub shoulders with anyone in your profession. That pride gets passed down, Madam Speaker, to the generation below. It also gives them hope. It gives them a pathway. And if we acquiesce because of whatever reason to professional bodies or otherwise that would thwart that, we are unworthy of this job. Madam Speaker, I don't know what the government thinks of my motion. I don't know what they will do with it. But what I do know is that if they're honest, they know that there are deficits there. I won't dare tell them how to do their job. I'm just going to remind them that their job, first and foremost, is to look out for the Cayman Islands and the Caymanian people and professionals in this instance. What they say, what they do after this is up to them. I'm just pointing out things that are brought to my attention from my constituents, and I'm sure each and every person in here has had some interventions about professional bodies in this country, good or bad. To give our people a fair chance, we need to have a baseline where if they achieve an international standard, we don't move forward and put in impediments like 20 years of overseas experience, 15 languages. If they have the minimum competency and it's at an internationally accepted level, our people have to be given a preference. I said it before, I'll reiterate it again, Madam Speaker. Caymanian should not be a qualification, but it definitely should not be a disqualification. Madam Speaker, it's time that we also put people in place that have either practiced in the profession or are not conflicted, who know more about that particular profession than a general immigration board. Long gone are the days when the wool should be pulled over our eyes, where terminology and semantics can fool a layman. We need to get more specific for our people. Madam Speaker, and in case someone wants an example of semantics in the immigration law, we have two creatures who are the same exact thing. One is called a salaried partner. One is called an associate partner. One demands a work permit fee of $18,000. The other, $30,000. And that's gone on and on and on in our immigration law. And it's the same position, but nobody calls it out. Madam Speaker, we need to wake up and look out for our people, because we are being bamboozled daily, or in some instances, we're bowing to special interests. Madam Speaker, like I said, I don't know what the government intends to do, but I do think that it's time that we put in place a regulatory regime, not unlike other first world countries where they have a qualifications authority, which is specifically designed to regulate professional bodies. Putting learned and competent people in charge in the specific disciplines so that the language is the same. The technical language, the loopholes, all those things are being examined when these applications come forward. Policies in place for recognizing a professional body, the functions that they must carry out to be called a professional body, uniformity across the professions, reports due on attracting young Caymanians specifically to those professions, providing them the training and the exposure, and hopefully, if they excel at all the things asked of them, that they rise to the very top of those professions, because that will go a long way in the future to having our people look out for themselves, having our people have a say in the future of this country, reduce the reliance on government. That might not be a good thing for some politicians. But our people standing on their own 2 feet, taking up their rightful places in this country, if they have done all the things we ask of them and have achieved an internationally accepted standard. That is what we as a government should be doing for our people. Madam Speaker, I think I've made my point. I think that if people are honest, they will see a lot of holes in the system that exists. And whilst I'm only a lowly opposition member with no numbers behind me, I would hope that this would not fall on deaf ears. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? I recognize the Honorable Minister responsible for Financial Services.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the motion is an interesting motion which covers a very significant range of issues. It's almost an alphabet soup of issues in the sense that we're not talking just about regulation of a particular profession. The member, the mover from Georgetown, the fifth elected member from Georgetown, has covered a lot of issues around regulation of professionals as well. And in his motion, Madam Speaker, he he lists quite a few professions as examples of those that are practiced in Cayman. And then on the last recital, he lists others that he thinks needs to be regulated and professional regulations put in place in respect of. Madam Speaker, quite a number of these professions listed are in fact regulated in various ways. And I think the concept of and the need for regulation in relation to these professions relate, as I think the member has rightly pointed out, relate to issues of public health, safety, impact on the country, on individuals. These are things that traditionally, Madam Speaker, we expect regulations or a regulatory regime around. So doctors, obviously, a great example. Madam Speaker, pharmacists, obviously another example. If you give somebody the wrong dosage of a drug, clearly you may in fact imperil their life. I think you can juxtapose that, Madam Speaker, against something like interior designers, where I don't think if you go home and you arrive in a house that is designed in very poor taste, that is going to make you collapse and be the end of your life. But it is understandable when you listen to the member and the extent to which he's talked around these issues, you get a better idea of what he really means in terms of regulation of these professions. And he's going more in the direction of, and I think he actually mentioned, having some sort of body that oversees professions, oversees the numbers, the extent to which they are qualified, and ensures that those qualifications are all valid. And Madam Speaker, I think on a number of occasions during his moving of the motion, he referred to what happens in first world countries and how the Cayman Islands should rightly have a similar sort of approach. Because, Madam Speaker, none of us will disagree that we certainly regard ourselves as a first world country. And I think we have every reason to feel that. But, Madam Speaker, one of the things that the member didn't do, to my recollection, is give an example of the kind of regime that he is referring to in general, which he says exists in other first world countries, with the overarching broad perspective that he was referring to. So, Madam Speaker, the member said he referred to the National Qualifications Authority, which might exist in certain countries. But I'm not sure, Madam Speaker, that that type of authority necessarily would have the very broad ambit or remit that that the member has referred to in all of his discussions on the various issues that are relevant to the Cayman Islands, to the safe working of our jurisdiction, to ensuring that people get the services that they require in a safe manner, in an appropriate manner, to a high standard. And that these are the types of people that fall within the broad profile of those that we would like to have in the Cayman Islands. Madam Speaker, the issue is one which, and the extent to which the member has described the various issues, these are issues, these are concerns that we all share. We all want to have it's professionals in the jurisdictions, in our jurisdiction, who can deliver the services that our people desire and need and want, but also strong professions, well-regulated professions that provide opportunities for our own people to get qualified in and to have great long careers in. It takes dedication for that sort of thing to happen, Madam Speaker. You can't, in terms of a lot of these careers, the qualification period, the amount of time you have to invest in education, various levels of it, and even sometimes the professional qualifications at the end, these are long-term commitments. That I know, I think we all know, that our people, some have already demonstrated that they are capable of doing that and achieving, and there are many others who are in the process right now, and undoubtedly those who are in our schools today, whether they are in primary school or whether they're in high school, or maybe they're even just starting off in early college, ICCI, UCCI. They have those same dreams and aspirations, and they have that same dedication to achieve these things for themselves and be a part of a successful economy and for their country. So the amount of dedication that they will have to bring to those sorts of careers, I think that will certainly be brought to their attention. And if they're looking at role models, they will find, Madam Speaker, that the ones who succeed, the ones who have long, strong, respectable careers, are those who are committed and dedicated and loyal and really put the effort into it. People who tend to jump around, Madam Speaker, who don't engage in an attitude of putting their backs into it will not likely succeed, but we certainly have many who have and many more who will. And the member's right, Madam Speaker. We have to make sure that the standards for those people who come in to our country are no less, no more for our own people who aspire to those roles, aspire to those professions. And it's interesting that he made the point that there are some professions where, and probably many, where there should be mandatory codes of conduct. We have, Madam Speaker, in the first list on the first page, one particular profession, that's attorneys, that we have at the moment only a voluntary code of conduct. And we have a proposal that would include a mandatory code of conduct. All of those, Madam Speaker, are essential. The regulation of these professions are essential. Consistency of qualifications and standards are essential. But Madam Speaker, much of the regulation about what is an appropriate qualification and standard is beyond the Cayman Islands as a jurisdiction. Often these things need much more resources around them to be able to support and defend certain qualifications, or the need for certain qualifications for certain designated professional levels that we have. So much of it exists external to the islands, Madam Speaker. And I think for us here in Cayman, we need to ensure that if there's a perceived gap and it is a significant issue, that steps should be taken to close the gap on, then we should do so. Many of the issues, many of the professions that are listed as examples, Madam Speaker, are professions that I think we do have examples of external qualifications and local or domestic legislation and regulation around. So, for example, Madam Speaker, many of the health practitioners in the traditional sense would be regulated. Accountants have been regulated since by their own legislation, as in conjunction with the Trade and Business Licensing Law, since 2007. But members will also know and remember, Madam Speaker, that we did fairly recently the Accountants Law, which was an amendment and repeal of the original 2007 legislation, which dealt with the regulation of accountants. Obviously, Madam Speaker, we have had others regulated for a long time. We've had the 1969 Legal Practitioners Law in respect of attorneys and the attempts to modernize that as an essential approach to keeping the regulation and supervision of that particular profession up to date and in accordance with current regulatory and other legal and international imperatives. Madam Speaker, I think the list for architects and contractors in particular, as far as I recall, that is going to be dealt with by the Builders Bill, certainly the contractors, and I think engineers, insofar as it relates to civil engineering in connection with the construction industry. Madam Speaker, we have, for example, real estate agents who historically have not been clearly regulated. They do have their own association, which has its own membership rules. But it's only more recently that we have the need for real estate agents to be properly regulated as a group of businesses that are generally referred to as designated non-financial businesses or business providers that we need to demonstrate proper regulation by an authority in the country for purposes of the anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism regime. That also relates, Madam Speaker, to the accountants and attorneys as well, as a very important aspect of what is needed. To ensure that those professions are regulated in accordance with both the needs from a domestic perspective, but also in accordance with international standards and expectations. Madam Speaker, the accounting profession and the legal profession in particular have been scrutinized internationally, not just Cayman, but wherever they are in the world, by those with an agenda who suggest that, with a very cynical perspective, that they are all potentially engaged in activities which facilitate wrongdoing on a global scale. Things like more than just money laundering suggestions. But I'm speaking more specifically about issues relevant to not even tax evasion, not even just an issue of tax evasion, but specifically in relation to things like tax avoidance and schemes that are being alleged to be what are referred to as aggressive tax avoidance schemes. Those two professions are, by some, considered to be facilitators or enablers, because they're engaged in effectively financial transactions and structuring of the flows of capital, which they say facilitate this. So you have an example there, Madam Speaker, of a need to have proper regulation in our own jurisdiction for our own domestic reasons, but also an imperative that we have to meet what are seemingly ever-changing global standards in order to address some of these concerns and perspectives. So, Madam Speaker, the accountants' law regulates the accountants today. We need a legal practitioner's law that is modern to regulate attorneys. We need the same mandatory code of conduct that the member from Georgetown was referring to in respect of that. Not just because we need to ensure that we have a standard to be able to hold them against, and we need to have a standard against which we can judge them on allegations of misconduct, but also important things, Madam Speaker, like the fact that because we don't have a mandatory code of conduct, that Caymanian lawyers are not able to easily requalify in the UK through a partial exemption process, what used to be called the Qualified Lawyers Transfer Test. It exists, it continues to exist in a similar form, Madam Speaker, but we Caymanian qualified lawyers can't take advantage of it because we do not have a mandatory code of conduct in place. Clearly that is something that is a disadvantage to our Caymanian lawyers, whether they're young or middle-aged and want to change careers, want to go abroad to work on their own or with a firm for experience and get requalified in the UK. They don't have that opportunity at this point unless their primary qualification is in the UK in terms of easily transferring across. So those are definite issues, Madam Speaker. And we certainly want the best opportunities available to our people. We certainly don't want them to be at a disadvantage in terms of someone coming into this jurisdiction and performing a particular role without having the right qualifications, without having equivalent qualifications. That we do not want, Madam Speaker. And I'll say, Madam Speaker, that the member, and I think all of us in here, probably goes without saying, But he made the point that he was pro-Caymanian. Well, we're all pro-Caymanian. Every one of us are pro-Caymanian, Madam Speaker. Some of us wouldn't be here doing this job for the benefit of the country unless we were pro-Caymanian. For some of us, it's not a job. For some of us, it's a passion, it's a love for our country. So, we're all pro-Caymanian, Madam Speaker. And in fact, Madam Speaker, I know the member won't deny the fact that probably the reason he is a lawyer today is because I went out to seek him out when I heard he was interested in doing law. I offered a scholarship to him. We took him on at the firm I was at, and he did his articles there, and he worked there. Madam Speaker, I didn't do that because I thought the member was ordained to be a great lawyer. I did it because I thought he was an intelligent, capable young Caymanian who we could offer the opportunity to. Because I am as pro-Caymanian as he is. Ever my ways? Let me tell you. Madam Speaker, the same is true for the member from Bordentown, the fourth elected member for Bordentown, not in terms of his qualification, but in terms of opportunities. But I leave it there for now. I didn't say I did you a favor. I said I supported you. Oh, I did? No. Not trying to bring you in it, but don't go there either. Madam Speaker, the point is, and I think we all accept it, that we're all pro-Caymanian. And whatever we can do to ensure that there are opportunities for Caymanians to get qualified, to be able to compete on a level playing field, to be able to achieve their dreams and aspirations, we'll do it. But Madam Speaker, I agree with the member that he said being a Caymanian is not a qualification, but it shouldn't be a disqualification. None of us would take issue with that. Sometimes, in certain circumstances, we feel that might not be the case. We feel sometimes that there are circumstances that being a Caymanian could be viewed as a disqualification. But Madam Speaker, I think those circumstances are the exception rather than the rule. But whether or not they're an exception, Madam Speaker, is neither here nor there. They shouldn't exist. But Madam Speaker, try as we might, no matter what policy we have in place, no matter what legislation, no matter how strong it is, no matter how much or how strongly you enforce it, there will be gaps. And there will be opportunities where people, the vagaries of human nature, cause people to behave in ways which are not appropriate, are not fair, and shouldn't be acceptable. And those things, Madam Speaker, are things we have to stamp out by ensuring that everyone else who is engaged in a profession or in a business in which those professions or professional staff are engaged set the right example. That the approach from the top, that the culture which the firm represents, the values which the firm or business represents, is a culture and our values which drive the right behavior, which values people based on their merit, based on their ability, based on their contribution, Madam Speaker. Sometimes, with the best will in the world, it doesn't happen. But if we have a culture, if we have an attitude, if we have an approach driven from the top down, there can be no stronger signal, Madam Speaker, that that is the kind of attitude, behavior, firm, business, culture, whichever category you want to stick it in. Those are the types of things, those are the types of behaviors we want to see. Because that makes society better. And it certainly ensures that any issues of discrimination, any issues about unfair treatment should be minimized, if not eliminated. Like I said, the vagaries of human nature being what it is, we are never, no legislation, no policy is ever going to eliminate it. It requires a combined approach in terms of proper regulation, legislation, policy, and the people at the top driving the right attitude and the right behavior. I don't know, Madam Speaker, that a board is really going to address that. I don't know that statistics are going to address that. I think if we had the best information, the best data, it could indicate a potential trend. It's not, you can't say that it's something definite, but it could indicate the potential for something going awry, whatever the reason is, whether there's a gap, or whether there's bad policy, whether there's just a failure of values, whatever it is, something isn't working. But it isn't necessarily going to make it go away. But Madam Speaker, if we're talking about ensuring that regulations are the same, then I think we can achieve that. If we're talking about ensuring that Caymanians, our own people, whatever their ages are, because today, Madam Speaker, people are interested in different careers. I talked earlier about what the old people used to call stickability. That means if you're going to do something, you stick with it and you stay, and that gives you the ability to progress. Madam Speaker, I worked in one firm from the time I was 18 years old. I grew up there. I developed there. I became a professional there, and I worked there until I went from being an article clerk to retiring as the chairman. So I think I know a little bit about stickability. Those things are important when you are looking at one career. But Madam Speaker, many of us are engaged in different careers. The average, I don't know about Cayman, but certainly around the world, there's a rule of thumb now that people go through between 5 and 7 different careers throughout their age range. Probably a lot less than that in Cayman. But we're talking about the potential for it. So there needs to be those opportunities preserved and fairness within each of those opportunities for our people. Obviously, one of those is to ensure proper regulation and to ensure proper standards and delivery of service. But not all of those careers, Madam Speaker, relate to the things like public safety, public health. Those are the types of things we definitely need strong regulatory bodies with strong legislation behind them. Some of the other ones, we might not need that unless we have things like these international imperatives, like the designated non-financial business providers I mentioned earlier. If we don't have those types of imperatives, then perhaps we don't need a heavy remit or a heavy framework of regulation around those positions. Because, Madam Speaker, at the end of the day, these things cost money as well. And there has to be a balance. You have to do a cost-benefit analysis to figure out whether it makes sense, whether there is a strong need to do something. And it's not too different from what the member was talking about in terms of looking at laws. And I agree. We should look at laws from time to time to ensure that they're fit for purpose, they're up to date, they're modern, and they deliver what we need them to deliver. So sometimes, Madam Speaker, you can have professional bodies that sort of loosely regulate professions. Madam Speaker, in terms of the list on the last page of the last recital of the resolution, of the private member's motion number 5, teachers, I think, don't have my colleague, the education minister here, but I think teachers are regulated. They're certainly regulated by the education department. I don't think you can just say that you are a teacher with a particular role and a particular level of capability without satisfying at least the international standards that are commonly accepted for that position and that role. Madam Speaker, surveyors as well, I think they have to be registered with the Lands and Survey Department, and I am pretty sure that there's legislation around that as well, which requires them to be qualified for the role they're performing, for the level of work and certifications and sign-off and all those things that they do. So, Madam Speaker, I think I think all of these positions are regulated to appropriate levels in terms of the need for regulation. And on the other side, in terms of these individuals coming to perform these roles and these professions in the country, if they're not Caymanian, they obviously have to satisfy the requirements of the immigration law. So between the immigration law and the businesses demonstrating the need to have these individuals and the professional bodies or the entities that they have to register with, we have both an assessment of the need to have them here and we have an assessment of their qualifications. So, Madam Speaker, I don't know that it's feasible for us to have a significant framework, some sort of overarching body that looks at all these holistic issues. Because if you do a cost-benefit analysis of that, the costs are going to be very substantial. And we have components of the perceived benefits of doing that performed by other bodies within the country at the moment, including the immigration, well, the Business Staffing Plan Board, for example, and the Immigration Board. So if we were to proceed, irrespective of doing a cost-benefit analysis, it would drive up the actual costs of providing these services to the people of the country. And if the benefits of doing that aren't there, then it's an unnecessary cost, and one which serves only to increase the cost of doing business, as well as increasing the cost of the services to the consumers. That doesn't serve anyone well, doesn't serve the country well, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, we also have the Department of Commerce and Investment, which doesn't deal with qualifications, but it does deal with licensing of businesses, and in many ways, in many respects, it also effectively licenses individuals within businesses. And that information, Madam Speaker, is a part of the data that the member from Georgetown, the 5th elected member from Georgetown, was referring to, in terms of information that is useful to the country, whether it's understanding what is happening in the economy, understanding the composition of the types of professionals that are in the country, and utilizing that information in some way to either base policy on or support policy conclusions. All of that information can be obtained, Madam Speaker, through the Department of Commerce and Investment by any government body that's engaged, and any ministry that's engaged in assessing what is going on in respect of their particular area of responsibility, their assigned constitutional responsibility, or if it's an overarching cross-ministry group, or if it's, for example, the Premier who's looking for information to support policy conclusions. All of that is available. Certainly in the areas that seem to be contemplated by this motion. Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the member also talked about ensuring that our international reputation was maintained. I absolutely agree with him. In fact, it's equally important to maintain the reputation of each profession within the jurisdiction, within the country as well. We certainly don't want to have people with a profession with a bad reputation within the country, demotivating any of our children who might be interested in pursuing a career in that area. Madam Speaker, I think the last number that I saw in respect of, for example, the two main perceived careers around the financial services industry outside of fund administration, fund directorship, corporate administration, those sorts of things, are obviously the accounting profession and the legal profession. And I think the last number I saw for Caymanians, well, the last number I saw for accounting professionals that are members of CEPA, the Cayman Islands Institute of Professional Accountants, was somewhere in the region of 1,010 or 1,015. And of that, around 109, 110 were Caymanians. We know that there are others outside of that as well, Madam Speaker, that have professional qualifications that perform very important roles, whether it's finance directors, CFOs, whatever title you want to give, and sometimes even in lower level roles, middle management. People have great careers, and it's important for those careers, those professions, to be respected as professions that people can aspire to be engaged in, to perform in. Similarly, Madam Speaker, it's the same is the case for the legal profession. I should say, Madam Speaker, obviously, of the 109 or 10 accountants that are members of CEPA, obviously some of those, to the member's point that he made, are people that became Caymanians after they were qualified as accountants. And in respect of the legal profession, there's somewhere around 700 lawyers, which between the two, between the accounting profession and the legal profession, must make the Cayman Islands one of the top jurisdictions or countries in the world for those two professions on a per capita basis. So the opportunities are there in significant ways, Madam Speaker. But for the legal profession, while there's around 700 lawyers, the numbers of Caymanian lawyers are in the region of 240. Now, again, to the member's point, there are some of those who were qualified and practicing before they became Caymanians. But once they become Caymanians, they are Caymanians. But we should, in some ways, be seeking to ensure that those opportunities are there for people, for our young people who are Caymanians, who go to obtain those qualifications and become qualified and practice in those professions. That is the critical aspect for us, Madam Speaker. And on this, in relation to the legal profession, we have the Cayman Islands, what was the Cayman Islands Law School is now called the Truman Bodden Law School, through which our young Caymanians can do the degree, do their professional practice course in Cayman, and do their articles here and get qualified. That is a phenomenal resource for the country, and it's a phenomenal opportunity for our young Caymanians. And I'm one of those. One time I was young, Madam Speaker. One time. I don't feel so young so much these days, but one time I was young. As I said, I started when I was 18 years old at the law school. I went through my entire career basically being the youngest of my peers, the baby of the firm. That's a hard thing to overcome sometimes. But it was a phenomenal opportunity that I had presented to me by a firm who were willing to provide sponsorship and give me the opportunity to become trained and get qualified. And I am very proud, immensely proud, Madam Speaker, of the students, the young Caymanian students who come out of that law school with fantastic grades. Some of them will do the PPC here, the professional practice course here, do their articles here and get qualified. Some of them will go to the UK and do their bar or the LPC and get qualified. Well, sorry, come back here and do their articles and get qualified. Doesn't matter. You know, the opportunity for them to be at home and to get a legal education at home while they're probably staying with their parents still at a very, very reasonable cost is immense. That law school is something for this country to be proud of. And it's essential for us, Madam Speaker, to ensure that certainly the regulation and supervision of that profession is modern, is top-notch, and has a mandatory code of conduct which provides all the benefits that I spoke of earlier. Madam Speaker, I think that the Caymanian Bar Association have something like 113 or 130. It's well over 100, I can tell you that. Student members of the Caymanian Bar Association who are engaged at various stages of the process of becoming qualified to practice law. Think about that number. That's a phenomenal amount of our young Caymanian students, because you have to be a Caymanian in order to be to join up to be a member of the Caymanian Bar Association or a student member. That's a phenomenal number. It means, Madam Speaker, that that is one profession that, and I'm not going to engage in arguments at this point about who gets to the top of firms or businesses engaged in that. But that is one that is a great example of the amount of penetration by young Caymanians and the opportunities that are open to them, Madam Speaker. It is something for us to be proud of. And Madam Speaker, many of them they come out with degrees, with passing grades, or I shouldn't say passing grades, overachieving grades, that certainly when a lot of us went to law school earlier, you might hear about a few people getting, but it's become more commonplace, like first class passes. It's amazing, the quality of students that are coming out of that. So yes, Madam Speaker, we need proper regulation around that. Yes, we need a consistent approach. And yes, we need a full framework which regulates that profession. Madam Speaker, the resolution in respect of this motion talks about the government considering putting in place the regulatory regime to facilitate the registration/regulation of all professionals and professional bodies in the Cayman Islands. Madam Speaker, I'm personally not sure that, I suppose you could have registration of professional bodies. I'm not sure you need regulation of professional bodies. You certainly do need regulation of the professionals and to ensure the standards that they're required to attain. So, in general, Madam Speaker, I see some of the merits of the motion as articulated by the member. In other areas, the benefits are probably less clear. I think, Madam Speaker, that you could do a cost-benefit analysis and reach the conclusion that while it might be some benefit to take an approach of regulating something, you don't want to go to the extreme. So these are all factors that have to be taken into account when we look at, these are all factors that have to be taken into account. And I think, Madam Speaker, while I don't agree with all of the points that are made, as I said, I can see the benefits in some areas, in some respects. And I think there's no harm in us looking at this to see whether these professions that are referred to in detail or specifically are ones that we need to consider. And perhaps whether there are any issues in particular that might need to be addressed. Some of them it's clear, without doubt, there are things that need to be done. Some of them, for some of them, it is abundantly clear that it needs to be done urgently or immediately. So, Madam Speaker, in the context of private member's motion number 5, in respect of the particular resolution, that the government consider putting in place the regulatory regime to facilitate the registration or regulation of all professionals and professional bodies in the islands, I think on behalf of the government I can indicate that we will so consider this, because I think it is, I gave examples where it's very clear, but I think we will, probably are already aware of a few that need to be looked at in more detail. Madam Speaker, thank you very much. And I will end my response in respect of this motion at that.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member recognize the 4th elected member from the District of Bordentown?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I will rise to give a brief contribution to this debate. I note that the Minister has responded and he seems to be indicating that he will support the motion. So I'd like to thank him for his support. Madam Speaker, there was just one point that the Minister made that I don't understand why he made it. But he referred to the 5th elected member and myself as being former employees of his. And I don't know if I guess he was trying to point out that we were Caymanians who were afforded opportunities, and he was demonstrating his pro-Caymanianness. But Madam Speaker, I don't see the relevance of having to point out how many Caymanians have been assisted and hired and so forth, because I don't think either one of the two of us were done any favors. We earned those positions, and we worked hard to achieve them. And, you know, I don't take kindly to being used as an example in a situation where I don't feel indebted to anybody. I earned my way. And I hope he was not implying that I am somehow indebted to anyone. I studied very hard in school, Madam Speaker, and I worked very hard. And there are many Caymanians who came up under me. When I started at that firm, I was the only person in the IT department. For 10 years, I built an IT infrastructure for that firm and hired many and trained many Caymanians. But I don't talk about them because, yeah, even the ones that got came here and got status. They're Caymanians. So, Madam Speaker, I won't get distracted. Madam Speaker, I'm a boxer. And I know sometimes when you're in a fight, your opponent might throw a punch at you in a way that you think they're open, and you get suckered in, and then you get a big right hand behind it. And I'm not going to get suckered into any boxing match up in here, Madam Speaker. I'm going to stick to the point. Madam Speaker, this motion, I think, highlights what a lot of Caymanians are concerned about, and is a lack of consumer protection. I can think of a recent example of a young lady who came to see me who is on the verge of losing her home to foreclosure. And it's not just one of those usual foreclosure situations. It's a young lady who built a home, but it was a duplex. And half of it she would live in, the other half she was going to rent. But the home was built by a contractor who was not qualified to be a contractor. That individual gave her very poor workmanship, Madam Speaker, and she ended up having to go back to the bank because he disappeared from the island and borrow more money to finish her home. And that put her way over what she could afford to manage. And the situation is, a sad situation is now that she's about to lose her home, and she is still out of pocket, even once the bank forecloses and sells the home. And she's young. So you can imagine the bleak future that's in front of her. She's going to spend quite a number of years repaying a debt and has nothing to show for it, all because some unscrupulous and dishonest individual ripped her off. So there is a need, Madam Speaker, for, I think, what this motion is partly calling for. Contractor. But it also highlights the need, Madam Speaker, for us to listen to the pleas for a heightened level of protection for consumers of goods and services. Because there are a lot of individuals who have come here and passed themselves off as something they're not. And it has had a negative impact on a number of people. So I think we do need to take steps that will ensure that we address that situation. In addition to that, Madam Speaker, a lot of these individuals are oftentimes non-Caymanians who are competing with Caymanians for jobs. And I think this motion is calling for us to set the bar so that these individuals can't just slip in unnoticed, pass themselves off, something they're not, and disenfranchise a Caymanian from potentially getting that position. Currently, I don't think there's an overarching way of sanctioning those individuals who don't adhere to what our standards should be. And in the end, Madam Speaker, this will affect people's pockets, whether by denying them employment or from the consumer protection side of things as well. So it would avoid those fly-by-night operations that we often see popping up here. They come in, they operate for a while, they rip people off, and then they disappear. It's not just the contractors. In addition to that, Madam Speaker, those individuals who actually take the time and make the investment to train and ensure that their employees or they themselves are operating at standards that are acceptable, are often putting themselves at a competitive disadvantage when they compete with those who do not. And I think it would only be fair that we have a level playing field. Again, I think that is what this motion speaks to. Creating this overarching regulatory regime would also create opportunities, set standards, educational standards, which then paves the way for an increased level of training and education, either within the islands or outside. But we always talk about the need for additional technical and vocational training, Madam Speaker, and this is one way that we can ensure that that is part of the agenda. I always talk, Madam Speaker, when I talk about technical and vocational training, about the role our seamen played in developing this country when they went away to sea, and they were trained and certified. Many of them earned certifications that they could and skills that they could come back home with, and many of them were successful in building this nation. When our men stopped going to sea, Madam Speaker, we created a void. And in respect to technical and vocational training, I don't think we picked it up to the level that we should have to continue. And that's why we hear the complaints, Madam Speaker, of Caymanians not getting opportunities. Because we're not doing enough to prepare them to take advantage of these opportunities that others have come here and received. So I don't think that we can be considered to be serious about advancing our people and protecting our people if we don't put regimes in place as the one that, as what is suggested in this motion, Madam Speaker. I think it also goes a long way in addressing a lot of the complaints we hear about people getting work permits who are not really necessarily qualified. Having the right standards in place would ensure that when it is necessary to bring someone in on a work permit, that they are qualified and they do have something that no other Caymanian can offer. We hear the complaints all the time, Madam Speaker, every one of us. And we know that the work permit system is not perfect. I think this addresses some of those concerns. Madam Speaker, the member from Georgetown mentioned the real estate market. And again, there are issues that many have encountered, many Caymanians have encountered in trying to enter that market. It's largely self-regulated, similarly to what is being proposed with the law firms. And in my opinion, there needs to be some sort of umbrella regulatory system that monitors what is happening within our real estate market. There are people here who are passing themselves off as real estate agents and so forth, who really do not conform to proper business rules and regulations. And I hear complaints all the time of unethical behavior. People who have come here without the necessary qualifications or experience, but who are licensed as agents and who are involved in real estate transactions. I know of a young couple who just recently invested in some property that they bought as an investment and were hoping to make some returns on their investment, by developing that property, and they are now out of pocket because of one individual who was assisting them with their real estate transactions and didn't know what he was doing. They trusted him to advise them, and in the end, they're the ones paying for it. I also remember a young man coming to me and talking about having attempted the Sariba entrance exam to become qualified or certified as a real estate agent and failing it by, I think it was 1 or 2 points. But when he and I sat down and went through the manual and the questions, it was clear to me that he had actually passed. But there was one individual who was responsible for telling him whether or not he had qualified. There's no check and balance there. He is completely at their mercy and was told he'd have to come back in a certain length of time to resit the exam. I think he eventually gave up. So, Madam Speaker, without the proper regime in place to monitor, and my background is in technology, and I know how fast technology moves, Madam Speaker. And you have individuals who will get certified 1 year as a Microsoft certified system engineer, and in 2 years that credential has been discontinued or advanced, and you have to recertify. And there really is no one here, no one body that is looking at these qualifications, because they're being used to justify work permits and saying, well, you no longer are certified. I've seen resumes come in front of me with these credentials clearly displayed, and me having more knowledge about the IT industry, knowing that this individual is no longer recognized by that institution as being certified. So we do need the proper structure in place, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I want to allow the mover of this motion to respond, so I'm not going to take up too much time. But I do see this motion as at least a solution in creating the proper regulatory regime. It encourages consistent standards locally. And I think it will guarantee a heightened quality of goods and services with proper regulation. I think it will help to remove some of the barriers for young Caymanians, especially trying to become employed in some of these industries. It enhances the level of consumer protection, as I talked about earlier, Madam Speaker. And it helps us to keep the unscrupulous and unethical individuals who only come here to exploit us out of the industries. And I think the most important point is that it will allow for the proper investigation and monitoring and safeguarding of these industries. So, Madam Speaker, I want to thank the member for bringing this motion forward, and I was more than happy to second it. He has, obviously, my full support. And I want to thank him for being an advocate for change that I think is positive, change that will improve this country. I've seen him bring many motions before this assembly, Madam Speaker, that I have to say I'm proud of him for being brave enough to bring them. Some were controversial, but he consistently puts forward solutions, well thought out solutions. And I heard the Honorable Premier on the radio the other morning saying that there's only one individual in this country he feels is qualified enough and experienced enough to be Minister for Financial Services, but I want to argue with that and beg to differ, that I know of at least two, including the 5th elected member from Georgetown, Madam Speaker. I think he's clearly demonstrated his commitment to Caymanians and to Cayman. With that, Madam Speaker, thank you, and I look forward to his wind-up.
Does any other member wish to speak? I recognize the sixth elected member from the District of Georgetown.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I rise just to give some brief comments on the private member's motion titled Motion to Establish the Registration of Professional Associations. Madam Speaker, I listened carefully, and I do believe that the intention of the motion is genuine, and I can appreciate some of the thoughts. Madam Speaker, I just wanted to rise to draw some caution, perhaps, when we talk about regulation and when we talk about putting standards, further standards in place, and when we look at all of these, some of the professions listed here. Madam Speaker, a lot of these, as stated earlier by the Minister, the Minister of Financial Services, are already regulated under their own laws. Some have laws coming up, such as the architects and engineers will be under the follow-up to the Builders Bill, contractors obviously under the Builders Law. Madam Speaker, real estate teachers, surveyors, they all are regulated under or listed under one category or the other, one law or the other. And I think the biggest issue there, perhaps, is the enforcement. I can appreciate that there are gaps, and I can appreciate that perhaps we need to go a step further in some of these areas, perhaps even on when you do your trade and business license. If I look at interior designers, for instance, and if we say interior designers, then we may have to talk about landscapers and others that claim to be professionals in that area. Perhaps we do have to ask for proof of professionalism in those areas if you're going to be licensed in that area. But one of the concerns I have, Madam Speaker, is the introduction of more red tape, the introduction of more regulation, the stress that it puts on small businesses in particular. And a lot of these businesses are centered around small business. A lot of them are single professional businesses. If you have interior designers, someone with an interior design may decide to do blinds or other little small things. They find their niche markets. But further regulation, further cost, because, Madam Speaker, when you talk about creating a agency to regulate all of these, and we heard about putting professionals in place that know what the requirements are. IT was brought up quite a few times, that those qualifications quite often expire. You have to continue to update your qualifications. I agree there. I agree. In my line of business, fire retardation or the exhaust hoods, the servicing of those, the fire systems are one of those where you have to constantly upgrade your certification. But I also know that quite often when we talk about developing another agency, we're looking at costs. How do we operate that agency? And then automatically there is a decision, well, we have to have a revenue income from that. So we have another layer. We have to prove our pensions, we have to prove our insurance, we have to prove our professionalism. We have to pay a fee for each one of those before we even go for a trade and business license or to renew that trade and business license. We have to be careful when we go down that road, where I do believe that all of the agencies are actually there, but we could tighten those up or add the requirements onto some of those, such as the trade and business license law. Obviously, those in the medical field fall under those councils and those boards as well. We also have to consider, Madam Speaker, that instead of removing barriers for Caymanians and small businesses, this could actually be a deterrent. And once you start to add regulations, further regulations, and then it gets into the technocrats and they start to add more and more and more requirements, we'll get to the point where we are now, where it's difficult for Caymanian doctors who graduate university to come home and practice practice their medicine. So we got to be careful that we don't get to that point to where it actually has a reverse effect, where businesses start to look for persons who already have those qualifications and those experiences, that experience before hiring them. So we'll have our young people coming out of university with a degree, with a certificate, or coming out of technical school, but not being able to get properly licensed to operate here because they don't have the prerequisite specialization or experience and all of those things. So it's just a word of caution, Madam Speaker, that we have to be careful with that.
Honorable sixth elected member, we've reached hour of interruption. I recognize Honorable Premier.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I move the suspension of Standing Order 10-2 in order that the business of the House may continue beyond the hour of interruption.
The question is that Standing Order 10-2 be suspended to allow the House to continue beyond the hour of interruption. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Against, no. I believe the ayes have it. The Standing Order 10-2 is hereby suspended. I recognize the sixth elected member from the District of Georgetown to continue his debate.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I won't be much longer. Madam Speaker, I heard a lot of comments about incidents, sad incidents where persons were taken advantage of, and it led me it reminded me of when I was a deputy chairman of Trade and Business Board, the amount of representation we got, persons looking for some sort of protection or some sort of recourse for these incidents. And so I believe that a lot of what was talked about here today speaks to the need for a Better Business Bureau or some sort of consumer protection agency. In a lot of instances, Madam Speaker, we would do as much as we could as a board, but in many, many instances, what it required is some sort of arbitration, and that's the sort of service that a Better Business Bureau could offer, or perhaps even some sort of consumer protection agency. And so I there were a lot of good ideas verbalized here today, and I'm really, just thinking that if we think about this a bit further and we look and we drill down into the separate different areas, but this is all clumped together in this one motion, and my only concern is over-regulation and the effects it will have on small Caymanian businesses and those trying to enter into the fields, into different fields. The other issue, Madam Speaker, I go right back to enforcement again. One of the bigger issues we have, and when we talk about, if you're operating a business that offers professional services or services that you have to be licensed under, you have your businesses, you are covering all the licenses, you're covering all insurances and stuff, but unfortunately, we still have a situation where people will approach your staff, will approach persons, not knowing whether they have the insurance qualifications or not to do work for them on the weekends and the evenings, and this is where we get in a lot of trouble. Right now, I have two separate construction projects happening in my neighborhood. And Madam Speaker, I can tell you the only time I hear a drill or a hammer or anything on those two projects is after 4 or after 12 on a Saturday or all day Sunday. I never hear a hammer or anything. You might hear one at 6 or 7 o'clock on an odd evening, but Saturday and Sunday, there's a full construction force on there, which tells me that those persons that are being hired to build those places are being hired as moonlighters or not through their proper employers or under the right circumstances. So a lot of these issues come down to enforcement. As the Minister of Financial Services said, we have many of these businesses are already regulated, many of these professions are already regulated under various laws, and I would just, place caution on when we talk about further regulation and developing further red tape and perhaps putting obstacles in the way for our young people to actually practice their entrepreneurial skills. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? Final call. Does any other member wish to speak? Recognize Honorable Minister responsible for education.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I rise to make a very limited contribution to this private member's motion. And, Madam Speaker, it is primarily in relation to the regulations as it relates to teachers. And as the private member's motion, I know it speaks to a number of categories, and they might list a few of them as examples. One of them stated specifically in the text of the motion is teachers, and so I want to make it very clear that this is something that's already been done or being done currently, but also has been contemplated to be done to a further degree, a more strengthened degree, as it relates to the new Education Law 2016, which was passed in this Honourable House last October. And so, Madam Speaker, just for the benefit of the listening public and also for those in the chamber, just to make sure that people are aware of what pertains currently as it relates to the registration and regulation of teaching and the teaching profession, is that no one in the country, as it relates to private schools currently, can teach in a school without being first registered by the Education Council. And the initial vetting process happens at the school level. The school is then makes a request to the Department of Education Services for recognition of the intended teachers, as in intended to be hired, teachers, qualifications. The Department of Education Services then goes through their assessment based on the qualifications and criteria which they follow, and they then in turn make a recommendation to the Education Council, who then decides to either register that individual as a licensed teacher in the jurisdiction or not. Madam Speaker, the process as it relates to public schools currently, and that is prior to the new provisions in the education law coming into force very shortly, is that the vetting, so to speak, takes place at the public service, the civil service level, and they require certain level of qualifications to be demonstrated, as well as if the person is being recruited as a teacher from overseas, as opposed to a locally trained Caymanian teacher, that is, or a trained Caymanian teacher who may have trained overseas. For recruits that they would that don't fall into that category, they would require a minimum of 2 years post-qualification professional experience prior to obtaining a position of being considered a teacher in the public school system. Also, as it relates to newly qualified Caymanian teachers, that is, there is a newly qualified teachers training program. So I know that there was a lot of talk in this particular debate about making sure that we train our local people to get the experience, the exposure, the necessary tools to be able to advance in their careers. The Ministry of Education has a newly qualified training program for newly qualified Caymanian teachers who may just have received their academic certification and may have a limited amount of actual experience in the classroom. So for the 2 years after they qualify, passing whatever licensure or whatever examinations that they have sat as a result of their training, they then get further guidance when they are absorbed into the public school system. So that is what really pertains currently. But Madam Speaker, under the new law and the new provision, as I said, the government certainly, as it relates to the teaching profession in particular, we recognize that the issue of ensuring that we not only register, but we have proper regulation of the profession and raising the standards within the profession was a key and critical part of that. Going forward, there will be a omnibus process, so a one process for all teachers in the country, be it public school teachers or private school teachers. There is a requirement that is contained in the Education Law 2016, which makes it a requirement for all teachers to be registered pursuant to Section 6 of the Education Law, which talks about the role and responsibility of the Education Council, who will be responsible for the registration and regulation of the teaching profession, both for public and private schools, as well as the regulations to further delineate what will be required for all teachers going forward is also being already drafted in regulations pursuant to Section 9 of the Education Law. So, Madam Speaker, as it relates to the teaching profession in particular and the profession of teaching and teachers, this is something that this private member's motion is already, I guess, acknowledging, maybe not directly, but what is called for in the private member's motion as it relates to the teaching profession is certainly well already being done and on its way to be strengthened already as we speak. One of the key things, Madam Speaker, that I'd like to remind the listening public and also the members of this chamber is to do with professional development. And since we took office as a government, there has been a new professional development policy which actually makes it mandatory for persons, as I said, currently now that professional development policy is applicable to public school teachers only. However, it is anticipated that this would be the requirement for all teaching going forward once that regulation of all teachers in the country then fits under the ambit of the Education Council. And the professional development policy makes it a requirement that there are certain number of hours per annum that teachers have to do in terms of upskilling themselves and keeping abreast with what is happening in the teaching profession. Because, Madam Speaker, we want and we recognize that the critical importance for having our teachers not just be seen as professionals, but continue to act and upskill and have the requisite information to keep themselves current, to keep themselves able to deliver the highest quality education possible. It is critical that these opportunities be made available. And not only is there a policy now that makes it a requirement that teachers are to do 60 hours of professional development work as a minimum, and this is also being tracked through the system that the Ministry of Education has implemented for professional development. As I said, it stands currently for public school teachers only, but the intention is that this is something that would be for the teaching profession for the country as a whole. It recognizes that the ministry that is and the government that we need to continue to strengthen the professional development offerings and opportunities. And that is why, Madam Speaker, one of the things that we've done since taking office is that we have redesigned to some degree the professional development offerings for teachers in the system. We have the regular professional development opportunities, both online, both by face-to-face. There is also the national conferences, which, by the way, there is a national conference that's coming up very shortly that reiterates professional development for the profession as a whole. And it is something that we have extended for the first time to include the support assistance. So not only is professional development being offered in a targeted way to teachers and other educators, we have the professional development that was offered for the first time, that is since we took office, to the support assistants, to give them targeted professional development so they can better do their jobs. And Madam Speaker, it's important to say that the support assistants are largely, if not all, Caymanians in our system. And so certainly the vast majority, if not 100%, I don't have the stats in front of me, so I don't want to give a number that I can't necessarily swear by, But I do know that the policy as it relates to recruiting special or the support assistants in the classroom has been to look to ensure that they get the Caymanians first. And they've been very good at ensuring that there's a very high percentage of Caymanians that are taken on in this regard. And now they also are being included in the professional development activities that are being offered to educators. And so we're finding that that is certainly making a difference, especially in the role that they play now as it relates to the interventions, the literacy and the numeracy interventions that are being rolled out or that have been rolled out across the system, especially at the year 1 and year 2 level. So we also have, Madam Speaker, on the other end of the spectrum, we know that in terms of raising standards and ensuring that we have the most effective education system possible, we need to strengthen and give the tools to the leadership and management. And so we've also implemented, since we took office, a targeted professional development and certification and qualification for all school leaders, that is principals, deputy principals, and this year it was extended to what's considered to be emerging leaders, and that is those persons who have either demonstrated the leadership qualities that we want, and we're using this as a potential form of succession planning for, again, Caymanians in the system, but also those who may have been recognized to be as such, either by volunteering to take part in the program or have been designated because of their contributions at the school level. So, Madam Speaker, that is very briefly an overview of the types of registration and regulation requirements, but also making sure that people understand in the chamber and in the wider community that as it relates to ensuring that our teachers, our educators, our support assistants are given the best opportunities to do their job, there has been a very targeted, focused, revamped, and professionalized professional development policy and program that has been put in place. And we are certainly starting to see the benefits of taking that kind of approach, both for the enhancement and advancement of our people, our teachers, our Caymanians who want to get into the profession. We give them that support when they start. Those first 2 years are critical, and we also give the they are provided with additional support going forward. But we've also made it, as I said, a requirement, because oftentimes, Madam Speaker, you know that persons that probably may need it least will take advantage of it most, and those that may need it most may not necessarily see it as something that they would want to necessarily take advantage of. So by making it a policy across the board, we take out the element of arbitrariness as to who takes advantage of professional development opportunities and who doesn't. So this is the way, Madam Speaker, specific to the teaching profession, that is, that this motion basically reinforces what we're already attempting to do and doing by and large. Thank you.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? Final call. Does any other member wish to speak? If not, I'll call on the mover should he wish to exercise his right of reply.
Madam Speaker, thank you for the opportunity to wrap up. Yeah. Madam Speaker, first I'd like to thank the government for its mixed acceptance of this motion. And I'm glad that we agree on a number of the important aspects, if not how. I'm also glad that Minister of Financial Services raised some important issues, and I'll address those shortly. Madam Speaker, when I was doing my research for this motion, I didn't make this stuff up. This isn't something that is fantasy. It's something that is widely practiced in those same first world countries that we like to say we are a part of. Madam Speaker, motion is really about quality control and standards. The acceptance that if we have professional bodies within our borders, that we hold them to an extremely high standard. We hold them to giving our young people opportunities to enter, train, and advance in those professions. Madam Speaker, if professional bodies recognize they play a very important role in nation building, and they operate on the standards and policies we put in place to ensure that they do, then Cayman will become exactly what it claims to be. Strengthening social responsiveness and accountability within professions and promoting pride in association for all professions. That's what this motion is about, just in case people missed it. Redress, Madam Speaker, is of utmost importance. And I thank the 6th elected member from Georgetown for his interventions. And I said in my delivery that I was not going to try to dictate to the government how to do this, but that something needed to be done if we were going to consider ourselves first world. It's also critical that perceptions of exclusionary practices be addressed up front, that professions do not apply unjust policies and practices in regards to who gains access, who gets training, who gets advancement, and who ultimately reaches the mountaintop. Madam Speaker, trust but verify. Definitions such as professional body, holding them all to equivalent standards. Words like progression, pathway, that all professions should have vis-a-vis our Caymanian professionals and others. And the route to qualification, Madam Speaker, that can't be refuted and can't be subjectively manipulated to rule out people with those minimum internationally accepted standards. Madam Speaker, we can't just call ourselves first world. We have to put up or shut up. But, Madam Speaker, the response to my private member's motion seemed to have taken some specific journeys away from what I even spoke about. At least not, if I touched on them, they were very brief. And I'm not going to get here and get into debates about who stayed or who stays long enough, etc., in a place to achieve the highest heights, who acts as role models, and the people that get there don't have any complaints, so why should a lowly MLA try to regulate industries that have nothing to do with? Madam Speaker, it's about good governance, and that's what we're charged with here. Not only in the way we practice our role, we do our role, but also in the way that we facilitate and regulate others in doing. Madam Speaker, Minister for Financial Services brought up mandatory codes. And I just wanted to touch on one thing, because he mentioned the legal practitioners bill and the fact that that was one which has a proposed mandatory code of conduct. And I don't know if we're reading the same bill, or if the minister will be bringing some changes at committee stage. But if I look at section 38, 4, and 5, subsection 4 says that attorneys and law companies shall observe the code of professional conduct set out in Part 1 of Schedule 2, and law firms shall observe the law firm's best practice guidelines set out in Part 2 of Schedule 2. Then subsection 5 says that a failure to comply with subsection 4 does not amount.
Recognized Honourable Minister responsible for financial services.
Madam Speaker, I apologize. I just would like to clarify whether this perhaps infringes the rule of anticipation, because we do have a bill on the agenda, and that seems to be the direction he's going, but perhaps I'm wrong.
Fifth elected member from Georgetown, the source from which you're referring is the current
This
legal practitioner, or is it the draft bill?
I'm addressing the quote from the minister saying that the proposal is a mandatory code of conduct. So I'm reading from the draft bill.
If you could just generally refer to it without stating specifically, because the bill has not yet reached the floor for debate and there's a rule against anticipation, so refrain from stating anything that is specific within the bill until it comes for debate.
So I can't read what's specifically in the bill.
No,
Okay.
not at this stage, when the bill comes up.
All right, Madam Speaker. But anything which says, here's a code, but you don't have to follow it, I don't consider that mandatory, Madam Speaker. But anyway, let's look at modern laws that govern professions. If we're saying that we want to modernize our laws and put in best practice, let's look at the UK. Let's look at the language in terms of this code forms 10 mandatory principles, full stop. Let's look at inclusions, Madam Speaker, in those modern laws that we aspire to bring into the Cayman Islands. And let's look at equality and diversity, which is nowhere in a number of these professional codes and of conduct that I've referenced in my motion. The chapter in the code encourages equality of opportunity and respect for diversity, preventing unlawful discrimination. As a matter of general law, you must comply with the requirements set out in legislation, including Equality Act 2010. Your approach to recruitment and employment encourages equality of opportunity and respect for diversity. You have appropriate arrangements in place to ensure that you monitor, report, and where appropriate, publish workforce diversity data. Indicative behaviors, Madam Speaker, it goes further. It says, acting in the following ways may tend to show that you have achieved these outcomes and therefore complied with the principles. And it sets out a commitment to the principles of equality and diversity and legislative requirements. A requirement that all employees and managers comply with the outcomes. Provisions to encompass your recruitment and interview processes. Details of how your firm will implement, monitor, evaluate, and update the policy. Details of how the firm will ensure equality in relation to the treatment of employees, managers, clients, and third-party instructed in connection with client matters. And it goes on and on, Madam Speaker. This is modern legislation that governs other legal arenas. Then we also have in there the same requirements that we want to put in and that the minister spoke about in terms of anti-money laundering and data protection and other things that enhance the profession and training around that. But it also talks about identifying, monitoring, and managing the compliance of your overseas practices and indicative behaviors again. It also includes in-house legal. It includes managing client money. Those are modern things, Madam Speaker. And if they're not in a proposed legislation, if they're not in existence, then I think that we need to take a look at the laws and ensure that when we're tweaking them and calling them modernized, they're holistically modernized and not subjectively modernized. Madam Speaker, I didn't really want to go into that, but I thought I needed to answer that. Madam Speaker, we can't have our cake and eat it too, right? We can't subject our people to standards that don't have the entire government's input, because we all represent people. And I'm hoping that in some of the 135 amendments that we are put in, that shows that holistic approach. Madam Speaker, I'm not going to go into that because there'll be lots of debate later on. But I'd like to publicly thank the Minister of Financial Services, because he rightly stated that he gave me my first opportunity in law, and that I probably wouldn't be here or I wouldn't be a lawyer if it were not for that opportunity. And I have always thanked him for that, publicly, privately, and otherwise. But I would equally encourage him to thank those in this public arena who helped him get there. And that I know that they are as pro-Caymanian as any of us, and that they were very happy for him to achieve the heights that he's achieved. So I'm man enough to publicly acknowledge the minister. I hope he publicly acknowledges those people that got him, that helped get him to his spot, because he likely would not have been an equity partner in this firm if not for that intervention. Madam Speaker.
Order.
Madam Speaker, I'll leave that between two private individuals to make any expressions of gratitude. But Madam Speaker, the minister was right when he said that it has to be driven from the top down. Right? Because the other thing he talked about was culture of the firm. But Madam Speaker, and again, I'm not going to go into this too much, but when I speak, Madam Speaker, on these issues, I also speak from experience. And I've seen it on many heads. I have been in places of employ where different training standards apply to different people. And it was only luck of the draw sometimes where you got somebody that would take the time to invest in your progression and your future. And that's what I'm trying to guard against, Madam Speaker. It should not be a subjective, arbitrary process. And even though the minister spoke about the culture from the top down, even when people portray that they have training programs, no one is checking to see whether or not they're actually effective and they're comprehensive and they cover everyone. Because I sat on the business staffing plan board, Madam Speaker, and I used to see the business staffing plans. And if everybody that was listed there 8 years ago, 9 years ago, and they've been listed there past before that, got the training that the firm said that they were getting, there would be many more Caymanian equity partners. And Madam Speaker, when I talk about data, here's what I'm talking about, right? The same law school that the minister was so proud of being an alumnus of, I'm from that law school as well, Madam Speaker, right? But maybe the member from Bordentown, the third elected member from Bordentown, will say this. He and his cohort of equity partners between 1997 and 1999 were the last people made equity partners from this school that is now producing, by his own words, better and better quality of results for graduates. 1997 to 1999. There's been one Caymanian schooled, not law school, attorney that has made equity partner since that time in major law firms. Data, Madam Speaker. If those numbers don't speak out to the people in this hallowed hall and cause us some concern and raise questions that we need to ask from the fraternity, then we absolutely need my motion to regulate or see whether self-regulation works and to set standards, set expectations, and like those first world countries, do it in an outcomes-based set of legislation and policies. Because, Madam Speaker, 1 in 20 years, let me not talk about how some of those got to their positions. Not because they weren't good enough, Madam Speaker, right? Because the same people that we're now putting in charge of the legislation and the policies and all of those things haven't done the right thing by way of their people. And we talk about opportunities. We talk about we should be very grateful for scholarships and articles. But what happens to the people that finish the articles that don't get employed? The ones that get employed, but 20 years later, they're still languishing there. Madam Speaker, the numbers don't lie. We need, as a country, to look the professions across the board and put in standards, monitor those standards, and hold professional bodies accountable. It's what is done in every first world country. Madam Speaker, I am looking at some of the examples that people have come to me for, and some of them were raised by other people in the room, including on the government bench. When people start off as professionals and they don't keep up with their professional designations, they don't keep up with their fees, and they still keep holding themselves out as professionals, including associated with bodies, right? Absolutely. We are not doing our job, because that's not quality control. That's not quality assessment. I'm glad that the Minister of Education has said this is what they're doing and this is what is going to happen in the new law. And I'm talking specifically about continuing education. But that does not happen across the board. It doesn't happen in the legal fraternity, Madam Speaker, but it does in the UK. We need to accept that there are gaps, and I'm glad that the government has accepted that. And I, for one, will wait to see how we enforce consistency of standards across the board and hold people accountable and assure the public that if they have any concerns, those complaints will be heard in a timely manner, and they will have solutions coming out of that, or at least determinations by a body that is entitled and authorized to do so. Madam Speaker, people who do shoddy work, who call themselves professionals, need to be sanctioned and held accountable. That is the overriding public policy position. When we have different standards in training, when we have people that are allowed to practice without any nexus to the country, when they can hold themselves out as something that's not authorized in any of our laws, we have to close those gaps. Madam Speaker, I'm not going to go further other than saying statistics and data help drive policy. And I agree with the Minister of Financial Services when he said that. What I disagree with him on is that we have that across the board and that we are using that data in an effective manner. We have industries and professions that we know Caymanians are not encouraged to go into. We know that there's no curriculum in schools pertaining to that. All those things are the drill down bits that we need to be focusing on. If an area is full of work permits, we should be encouraging our people to get into there because we know that there are jobs available. Madam Speaker, strategic growth, sustainable vocations, that stickability that the minister spoke about. I wonder if some of our people would have more stickability if they thought they had a future in some of these organizations and some of these professions. When people take an interest in them from the beginning. Madam Speaker, a lot of our people are coming from very blue-collar existences, wooden spoons in their mouths. That initial entry into professional service is akin to speaking and learning a new language. We need to develop our people. We need to ensure that those that are here are developing them in accordance with the standards that we've set, in accordance with the immigration law. And if they don't have the culture from the top down, then we remind them of it, Madam Speaker. Thank you very much.
The question is, be it therefore resolved that the government consider putting in place the regulatory regime to facilitate the registration regulation of all professionals and professional bodies in the Cayman Islands. All those in favor, please say aye. Against, no. The ayes have it. Accordingly, motion 5 of 2016-2017 is passed. We'll take the afternoon break at this time.